Madam Speaker, I rise with a sense of responsibility as a member of the LGBTI community to speak on this bill. I share a background of a quest for rights, equality, inclusion, dignity and respect, and yet I realise that on reflecting on the diversity of our community, I do not share or represent the diversity of experience. My own experience of discrimination pales into insignificance indeed in comparison to others. For my experience has been of strained relationships and estrangement from loved ones for a time, of limited public expression and at times fear and shame, but I am fortunate not to have experienced, for example, physical violence, loss of job opportunities, deep mental scars, or indeed loss of life. This debate matters for people like Rosemary Harwood and her daughter Marjorie, known to her as Marty, a transgender person whose change of gender was not recognised by the system that allowed her to be incarcerated in the men's prison, who was bashed and abused, raped so severely that she required a colostomy and eventually tragically lost her life when she gave up the very will to live and denied treatment for kidney failure because she had lost hope that she would be cared for and protected by the laws of this state. The law needs to change for the safety of transgender people. I realise that it's taken most of my lifetime for public opinion to shift sufficiently to recognise and include lesbian and gay people, at least in respect of marriage equality, but this past month has given me the opportunity to reflect and talk with many friends as well as advocates to realise that as a society we still have some way to go to shift the fear and misunderstanding of others in my community. And here I'm not absenting myself from ignorance and misunderstanding. And I particularly want to thank Dee Dee River and her partner Trish, and I acknowledge their presence in the gallery today, who so generously enlightened me and spent hours with me to help me navigate these issues. Rodney Croom and Robin Banks, long-standing advocates of the community, Martine Delaney also, Maddie Wright and Rowan Myers, again here today, and others who have engaged in the consultation these past 3 months or so with MPs. I know that some of these people have been tireless advocates for years for legal recognition and rights for trans and non-binary people, and all have shown incredible courage in coming forward to share their stories. The past 4-week recess has allowed a renewed hate campaign, but ironically, coinciding with this, a time of joy and celebration within the LGBTI community, with the 30th anniversary of the Tasmanian Gay and Lesbian Rights Group, now aptly renamed Equality Tasmania, the Marvellous Play, the campaign, and only last week the 1-year celebration of achieving marriage equality following the postal vote. This bill relates to the changes in the Federal Marriage Act 1961. These changes were a move to recognise the rights of LGBTI people to marry and end discrimination based on who we love. It was a move towards equality, a move to recognise we are members of society and that our society is diverse. I mentioned that last week there was a celebration to mark the end of the Marriage Equality Survey a year ago. That survey, in my view, was pointless and it was expensive at around $122 million budgeted. It only confirmed what polls had been saying for many years. It was widely seen as a tactic by the federal Liberal government to delay addressing the issue of marriage equality in Parliament and to satisfy the deeply conservative homophobic wing of their party, a group that has apparently recently unseated Malcolm Turnbull and taken control of government. The survey also served the purpose of providing hate groups a national platform for a number of months. It was to prevent this that the plebiscite was rejected by the Senate. The long duration in which conservative culture warriors were given a national voice had a devastating effect on many of the people whose rights were being put to a vote. The arguments were not about marriage, but about acceptance of LGBTI people. As others speaking on this bill have pointed out, not only was there an overwhelming yes vote nationally of 7.8 million Australians, or 61.6%, and with almost 80% rate of return, it was a resounding result. And the vote in Tasmania was the second most supportive nationally. The vote here in Clark was 74% in favour. My own electorate of Franklin was only slightly lower at 69%. That's still much higher than the state's average of 63.6%, and it's still 7 out of 10 people supporting marriage equality. But, Madam Speaker, this is still 3 out of 10 people in my community that do not share my views or my values. This has had a personal impact on me. For me, achieving marriage equality means, amongst other things, choice for me and my long-term partner, but just as importantly, dignity of equality under the law. It also means convenience and efficiency, a streamlined administrative processes, and I look forward to a time when my passport application won't take 3 times of toing and froing from the Australia Post Office in order to jump additional hurdles just to explain why it is that our son doesn't comply to the form that says mother and father. When it says, when the form instead says parent 1 and parent 2, won't that be easier? It means recognition of our relationship, and I hope will mean even more to our 10-year-old son, and a strong signal to his generation about inclusion, diversity, tolerance, dignity and respect. On the 15th of November 2017 at Cascade Hotel, I was present, along with so many others, nervously awaiting the result of what felt like a national survey of judgment. I felt the collective exhale of a previously marginalised community, and along with so many others, shed tears. Following an 8-week postal survey and associated sustained hate campaign that went on 4 months. Some had waited decades for legislation to wed lifelong partners. Others barely passed the age of consent, celebrating what this would mean for a better future for themselves and a more just society. For us, as same-sex parents, we simply hope that our son will grow up in a society that is more tolerant, that he never questions the value of our family, and that he is never forced to defend his parents. As I said, the marriage survey provided a platform for those who push homophobia, with outrageous statements about same-sex parents and attacks on anti-bullying campaigns designed to help a group of children, who experience high levels of overt bullying and subtle discrimination. Children who have same-sex parents, children who are same-sex attracted or assumed to be same-sex attracted, because children are often not really aware yet of what their sexual orientation may be. These children are subject to bullying, verbal and physical violence and isolation at far higher rates than the general population. This pressure has a number of negative outcomes, ranging from harming learning and academic performance to self-harm and even suicide. Yet programs to help teachers be aware of and address this sort of violence have been targeted, and were targeted often by the No campaign. But there was something about the No campaign many people noticed. The target for hatred and fear of difference was often not lesbian and gay people, but trans and gender diverse people. Fear of a boy in a dress, so to speak. Fear of anti-bullying campaigns designed to address not only homophobia, but transphobia. Tony Abbott and others attacked gender fluidity. Gender diversity is an easier target today than gay people. The sense of being targets, of being under assault, was greater for trans people than for the gay community. It resulted in increased anti-trans violence, including the assault of a 16-year-old in the Elizabeth Street Mall. Trans people feel the hate campaign has not really ended, with comments like those from Prime Minister Morrison about so-called gender whisperers. 3 weeks ago, he called for removal of gender markers from birth certificates and driver's licence. Nonsense. Without seeming to realise that there had been no gender markers on driver's licences for over a decade. The bill before us is said to be about marriage. It is true that this bill has a deadline of the 8th of December, as I understand it, in order to eliminate the requirement for trans people to divorce a loving spouse if they want to change their legal gender. But the survey was about more than marriage. The No campaign tried to make it a referendum on the equality of LGBTI people. It was nominally about marriage, but almost no objection focused on marriage. It was about lesbian and gay people. It was about trans and gender diverse people. It was about generating fear and hatred in order to prevent equality. It was about making some people other. In many ways, this bill is not just about correcting some of the so-called otherising and discrimination against lesbian and gay people, with the motive force being the need to correct a discriminatory measure in relation to birth certificates for trans people. This is the ideal time to address the even more discriminatory measures in the same part of the same Act, governing the same issue: restrictions on trans people getting a birth certificate that matches their identity. Madam Speaker, trans people who are married cannot change their legal gender unless they divorce, even though they have changed their gender and neither they or their spouse wants a divorce. This is terrible on any human level and is only there to protect an illusion that same-sex couples cannot form real emotional and social bonds. But the number of people in this situation is very small. Far worse is the requirement for genital surgery. This impacts all people wanting to change their legal gender. It is an almost insurmountable barrier for trans men, as Cassie O'Connor, member for Clark, has made clear. It is a problem for non-binary people and anyone who does not feel their gender resides in their genitals. It's a problem for those who cannot do this for medical reasons. It's a problem for trans children who cannot get access to surgery. Complicating this is the difficulty of getting the surgery itself and the compromises a person may need to make. The surgery requirement is even a barrier for those who want such surgery. Madam Speaker, for trans women, an operation generally costs over $25,000, which is not covered by Medicare or private health insurance. That's the base cost for the simpler form of surgery. It doesn't count time off, hospital fees, or the fact that almost no surgeons in Australia who perform such surgery, so surgery entails overseas travel. To get permission involves at least a year of living as the gender of identity while being monitored by a psychiatrist through regular visits and then getting a second psychiatrist to also approve. This means that for many people wanting surgery, they live for years without it and without any ability to change their legal gender. So, the majority of trans people born in Tasmania find it impossible to change their gender on their birth certificate, even if they want surgery. Happily, the requirement to change it on a passport is not so restrictive. The federal government dropped the surgery requirement in 2011, a year after the requirement was dropped for US passports. Gender markers were removed from driver's licences over a decade ago. This allows many trans people to be accepted as they are, unless, of course, a birth certificate is required. The changes in this bill have been celebrated in the media as a boon for trans people, but the actual changes are minimal and affect very few people. Since this bill is about justice and equality and ending discrimination, there is no reason we cannot fix other aspects. Since we're addressing the issue of barriers to trans people changing their legal identity, we should address the issue more comprehensively. This is why I will be supporting these amendments. There is no reason at all not to address this, except an unwillingness to do anything to address issues of equality and discrimination. The government here is determined to do no more than they are forced to do. Unfortunately, this is not unusual and is the reason trans activists have worked so hard to dispel myths and improve understanding. The ability to change gender on a birth certificate was introduced in 2001 and became law on the first day of 2002. Since then, it has not changed or been touched. The 2001 amendment was to catch up to international norms, with Sweden being the first nation to allow legal change of gender in 1972 and several other nations doing the same in the following decade. In other words, the 2001 amendment was already over 20 years behind the times. Madam Speaker, since that time, the standard international practice has become allowing trans people to change gender through a simple declaration without surgery or medical intervention. The current best practice in terms of international human rights is to leave gender markers off of identity documents in the same way as we leave off race. It is no impediment to anyone and results in fewer avenues for discrimination. Trans people have been trying to update our laws for years. As acknowledged by my colleague Ms Haddad, Martine Delaney has been advocating for change for well over a decade and has spoken on this to at least the last 9 Attorneys General, to my knowledge. This issue has been at the very fringe of LGBTI human rights, and so it has been considered too hard, going too far. And so it's always been up for review or consultation or a report, and governments have been slow to act. Indeed, there has been no change since Part 4A was introduced 17 years ago. So, when the change of gender must be dealt with, it is the opportunity to address long-standing issues. It is a chance to look at implementing changes recommended by the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner in 2016, recommendations made after extensive consultation. Instead, the government would like more consultation, more reviews, to do only what the federal government force it to do. And so I'm critical and suspicious of this Liberal government that makes no commitment to progressive policy in this area, no commitment to anything other than putting things off again. I'm suspicious of these delay tactics. When will a government bill addressing births, deaths and marriages, Registration Act 1999, come again before this Parliament? Possibly not for decades. We cannot and we should not wait. Now is the time. The federal government made changes, so has the ACT in South Australia. They allow change of passports and birth certificates without surgery and allow for more two genders, though its laws also now fall behind international standards. Gender markers have been off driver's licence in all states for over a decade. The world has not ended. No one has lost awareness of their gender. What these amendments will do, to the best of my understanding, is to eliminate the requirements for genital surgery and other medical intervention and simply recognise a person's gender identity on their declaration. This is now standard internationally, even in Pakistan or India. The amendments do two other things. They create and allow choice to allow gender not to be shown on the birth certificate. It allows that to parents for their children. It allows that to mature people for themselves. It doesn't stop or deny gender, and it doesn't stop the registrar or health professionals from collecting information about gender or sex. It doesn't interfere with statistics. It just makes a choice whether or not it's on the ID. This is not radical, and it's in line with international recommendations and current best practice. The other issue is for intersex children. This is an area where the record of virtually all governments and medical professionals is a disgrace. The unnecessary and deferrable genital surgery on infants. I understand the recommendations from Transforming Tasmania to criminalise such surgery have been sent to the Tasmania Law Reform Institute, and I can only hope government will act on their findings. One part of the proposals for intersex people is incorporated here in this bill, or amendments. That is to allow the parents of a child who is not clearly male or female a longer period to make a decision how to raise such a child. No one expects to have such a child. Learning the implications of their decisions is important for parents to avoid pain and suffering in the children. Allowing an extension from 60 days to 120 days will allow parents to make decisions with more information and less pressure. It may avoid imposing avoidable surgeries onto children designed to make people other than the children comfortable. The bill before us and the amendments from Labor also address the Anti-Discrimination Act. The intent of the government amendment is to look like introducing additional barriers to same-sex marriage in the name of religious freedom. Their amendment adds nothing to the federal anti-discrimination provisions and was, at least originally, poorly drafted. Our amendments are basically a small modernisation of the language in the Act, some at the request of intersex people to correspond to international definitions. In summary, Madam Speaker, I believe the government's proposal to protect ministers of religion from discrimination claims is 1. Unnecessary because federal law provides sufficient protection already. 2. Does not achieve its stated goal because it actually protects the recipient of the minister's service, i.e. the couple seeking to marry, not the minister, and protects them on the ground of their religion, not their sexual orientation or gender identity. And thirdly, stigmatises same-sex couples as a unique threat to marriage and religion, because never before have ministers of religion been given this extra superfluous and theatrical layer of legislative so-called protection in regard to marriages they may want to refuse to solemnise. Community advocates strongly support our proposal to include gender identity and intersex variations as protected attributes under Section 19 of the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act. Protections for transgender people against hate speech were in place from 1998 until 2014 when they were accidentally removed. The amendment will reinstate those protections. It will not create them anew. The only significant change is to include people with gender identity and intersex variations as protected from hate speech. This past weekend, they cited the Australian Christian Lobby as claiming this was new and would allow all sorts of vexatious litigation. This is simply a lie. As many here know, these were both protected classes but were amalgamated as part of sexual orientation. A few years ago, the Act was corrected and intersex and gender identity were seen as separate issues having nothing to do with who a person is attracted to. In separating these out, they were inadvertently left out of Section 19 that governs hate speech. So they went from protected to unprotected. The Anti-Discrimination Commissioner at the time asked this to be fixed. She was told that it would be with the next Justice Omnibus Bill. That was 2 years ago. Bills have come and gone and it still has not been fixed. This fixes it now. The bar for considering something hate speech is high. It isn't for trivial comments. There's been a campaign of misinformation and lies about this.
By
it's
the
not
Attorney
a problem,
General, no less.
and repairs a mistake and must be fixed, and now is better than someday. Last week was the first anniversary of the survey results, as I've said. Soon we'll have the first anniversary of the passage of marriage equality into law itself. Today, ironically, the 20th of November is another day of significance, and the House will be interested to know that it is the 18th Annual Transgender Day of Remembrance. Madam Speaker, what a fitting day for us to be debating these issues. For it's on this day each year that the trans and gender diverse community remember the people killed that year in transphobic violence. This year that amounts to 309 people known to have been shot, stabbed, tortured, dismembered or beaten to death. The number does not count suicides that resulted from transphobic violence. It does not include deaths from domestic violence or attributable to other causes, only killings with transphobia as the clear motive are counted. Even so, that's one person every 28 hours in the last year. Madam Speaker, anti-trans discrimination and violence is not limited to hate-based killing. It is systemic and affects trans people throughout their lives. It impacts them in terms of bullying and isolation of trans children in school, impacting their education and social development. It can take the shape of subtle marginalisation, the salesperson who ignores someone, jokes, comments, the way the media reports. It may affect a person's ability to get a job, to get housing, to access services. It can affect the way the police or other authorities treat someone. We tend to see trans people as men in dresses. This is partly because it's exactly how they're portrayed in film and television, with male actors playing a part. If the media wants a picture of a trans person, they often find an older trans woman, someone who looks trans. They tend not to use pictures of people like Nicole Maines, who don't look trans. They don't focus on people like Carolyn Cosey, who worked as a model and played a Bond girl in 1981 before she was outed. In particular, they very rarely focus on or include trans men or non-binary people. It's unfortunate and fits a media and political narrative that increasingly does not apply. It's a narrative that was used in the anti-marriage equality campaign. We heard about boys in dresses, never heard about girls in trousers. After all, women today wear jeans or trousers all the time. The truth is that trans people are just people. Some people happen to be trans. Like sexual orientation, it's not something people choose. It's part of who they are. That's what's meant by identity. There have always been trans people. They just weren't called that, although many non-European cultures did have words and roles for people outside the man or woman gender binary. There are words for trans people in most Native American cultures. There are words in most cultures. There are words from history as far back as the ancient Sumerians, Egyptians and Vedic Hindus. Trans people are just part of human diversity. They have lived as members of the opposite sex, often not discovered until they died or were hospitalised. It's not a new thing. The Roman Emperor, I can't pronounce this, Elagabalus, 2008 to 208 to 220 was definitely trans and wanted surgery. In Australia, we have our notorious figures in history as well. Edward de Lacy Evans, who after having been married 3 times with one wife giving birth, no less, was discovered to be a woman when hospitalised in 1879. Bill Edwards, who was discovered to be female in 1905, or Ellen Maguire, a notorious Sydney female prostitute who, on being discovered to be biologically male, was sentenced to death. Such things happened all over the world. Not all of them were discovered. Trans people are not trans on a whim. They're born trans. It's part of normal human diversity. They may have a hard time understanding it. They may try to deny or hide it, but it's part of them. Like same-sex attraction, they're culturally taught that it is not normal. We ignore it in history and reality. They're not pretending. The idea that some men may become trans to attack women is laughable. Domestic violence, rape and assault happens without anyone needing to dress up. And certainly not to go to the trouble of legal gender change. Women's services have publicly said they're inclusive of trans women now. They do not use birth certificates, and that trans women are the victims of violence, not the perpetrators. That's right. But gender diversity has increasingly been recognised, and today we're aware that this is how some people are. They're normal people. They have interests and skills. They contribute to society. They just want to get on with their lives. Being trans doesn't affect anyone else. Why do we have so many issues with their gender, and what gives us that right? Trans children in particular are now being recognised for what they are: children. Children who are quite happy if allowed to develop as themselves. Children who are miserable, in pain, if their inner self is denied. Even if they get good at hiding that self, it's there, and ultimately hiding it, repressing it, leads to negative outcomes. Parents know this. We know of Transforming Tasmania who are pushing reform, but other groups are asking for them. Tasmanian Families for Trans Kids are the parents who love and support their children. They didn't ask for their kids to be trans. The realisation that their children suffer when their identity is denied is often hard for parents, but loving parents would rather just see their children happy. I understand the Acting Commissioner for Children supports these amendments and says they're in accordance with international human rights approaches. I support them too, and I urge all of you to do the same. Madam Speaker, I finish on this point. Being trans is not ideological. They're not trying to erase gender. They know gender is something we are born with. They're not trying to destroy feminism. They know better than most the difference between how men and women are treated. It's time to stop punishing difference and realise that human diversity is not a problem. We don't all need to be pushed into a rigid box. Difference is not a thing to fear. Freedom that harms no one is not something we need to prevent. And choice for parents and trans and gender diverse people should be celebrated. I urge the Attorney-General, the Government and all in this place to support the amendments that will be brought forward today to strengthen this bill, to make it all that it can be.
Great speech. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honourable Dr Woodruff.